March 23, 1944, 6:30 in the morning. A German mortar shell screams down out of the gray Italian sky and explodes against the crest of a nameless ridge, hurling frozen dirt and shattered stone into the freezing air. Then another. Then 20 more. 300 German soldiers rise from the base of the slope and begin to climb, bayonets fixed, and at the top of that hill, a young man named Harold Jansen watches them come, waits until the first wave is fully exposed on open ground, and gives the order to fire. Machine guns tear the morning apart. Men fall. The slope becomes a killing ground. Harold Jansen was 23 years old. Before the war, he had never once left Texas. He was not a general. He was not a hero in any newspaper. He was a former high school football player from a dusty town called Lubbock, and on this morning he commanded exactly 18 men against a German battalion that outnumbered him more than 16-1. By nightfall, more than 140 German soldiers would lie dead or wounded on that hillside. His 18 would still be standing on that crest when it was over, breathing bloodied and unbroken. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next exciting videos. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and unforgettable moments of courage from the past. Become part of our community, and together, let's keep history alive. This is the story the American Army buried in a footnote. This is the story Hollywood never touched. And the only people who ever truly understood what happened on that ridge were the Germans who tried to take it, failed, and spent the rest of their lives trying to explain it. This is their testimony recorded in after-action reports, prisoner debriefings, and private memoirs that sat untouched in archives for decades. And it begins with a war the whole world had already chosen to forget. By the spring of 1944, the fighting in Italy had become the great orphan of the Second World War. While the entire planet held its breath for the coming invasion of France, while generals and politicians obsessed over Normandy, the men clawing their way up the Italian peninsula were dying in mud and ice and razor-edged mountains for ground the world would forget before their discharge papers were even signed. Allied command had a word for the Italian front. They called it secondary. That single word, chosen by men safe in offices hundreds of miles away, would haunt everyone who bled and froze and died there. The Germans understood something the Allies kept underestimating. In Italy, the geography itself was a weapon. Every ridge was a fortress. Every valley was a trap. Every river crossing could become a massacre. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander, had turned the mountains into a chain of defensive lines so brilliant they bordered on cruelty. His soldiers did not need superior numbers. They needed only the high ground, clear fields of fire into the valleys below, and patience. From those ridges, a handful of defenders could turn an entire attacking column into a graveyard, and they did again and again, until the valleys of Italy earned a grim reputation among the men ordered to advance through them. His masterpiece was called the Gustav Line. By March of 1944, it had held for 4 months. The American Fifth Army under General Mark Clark had been bleeding itself white against it. Monte Cassino had become a symbol of everything gone wrong in Italy, a grinding attritional nightmare with no end in sight. Thousands of young men had already died throwing themselves at fortified slopes exactly like the one Harold Jansen now defended. The math was simple and merciless. Attackers with overwhelming numbers took the high ground. Defenders who were badly outnumbered broke or died or surrendered. That was the rule. That was how it had always gone in every campaign on every front since the war began. Numbers won. Numbers always won. And into this exhausted, forgotten meat grinder came a small group of men from Texas, holding a ridgeline that nobody wanted and everybody suddenly desperately needed. On the maps, it had no name. It had only a number. Hill 587. A map coordinate. A statistic waiting to happen. Nothing about that cold designation warned anyone what was about to unfold there. Nothing prepared the German army for the 18 men dug into its crest. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody in the high command had ever heard of. Harold Jansen was never supposed to be extraordinary. He was born in Lubbock, in the flat, wind-scoured Texas Panhandle, the kind of place that produces people who do not complain and do not quit. He grew up working with his hands. He played football because in that part of Texas, football was less a game than a religion, a weekly lesson in taking a hit, getting back up and refusing to stay down. He was not a scholar. He was not loud. Before 1942, the biggest crowd he had ever performed in front of was a small-town stadium on a Friday night. The men who served under him remembered him the same way. Quiet. Steady. The kind of officer who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He belonged to Company F 2nd Battalion, 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division, a Texas National Guard outfit made up of farmers, mechanics, welders, oil field roughnecks, and ranch hands. These were not soft men from comfortable places. They had grown up in a hard America that still remembered the frontier, and Jansen understood them because he was one of them. He also understood something most young officers took years to learn, if they ever learned it at all. He knew that the difference between a unit that holds and a unit that breaks has almost nothing to do with equipment or numbers. It comes from something much harder to measure, something buried inside the men themselves. And in the freezing days before the German assault, walking that lonely ridge with the wind cutting straight through his coat, Harold Jansen began to form an idea. An idea so simple and so obsessive that some of his fellow officers quietly thought he had lost his mind. His men would live or die by it. And then, one cold gray morning, with 300 enemy soldiers massing at the foot of the slope, that idea would finally be put to the ultimate unforgiving test. The idea was this. Jansen flatly refused to accept that 18 men were too few to hold Hill 587. Instead of treating his tiny command as a doomed picket line waiting to be swept away, he decided to turn it into a fortress. Not with concrete, not with steel. With preparation so precise, so ruthless, so obsessive, that 18 rifles would sound and strike like 100. In the days before the attack, Jansen did something that struck other men as pointless, even insane. He walked every single inch of that ridge over and over on his hands and knees in the frozen dirt. He studied every angle. He measured every distance. He assigned each of his men a specific position and a specific field of fire, mapping out exactly where each weapon could do the most damage, and exactly which stretch of slope each rifle and machine gun would cover. He made certain that no attacker could climb that hill without walking straight into overlapping cones of fire coming from several directions at once. Think of it like this. Imagine 18 men trying to guard a huge house from hundreds of intruders. Most would panic, cluster together, and get overwhelmed in minutes. Jansen did the exact opposite. He turned every window into a trap, made sure every doorway was covered from 2 angles, and rehearsed his men until they could defend the whole house in their sleep. He was no longer commanding 18 separate soldiers. He was building a single integrated weapon with 18 triggers, a machine designed to turn open ground into a place no man could cross and live. He drilled the plan again and again until that ridge was as familiar to his men as their own hands. Some grumbled. Some thought the endless rehearsals were a waste of strength against an enemy that would simply swarm them anyway. On paper, the doubters were right. Every rule of war said a position held by fewer than 20 men with no support and no reinforcements could not survive a determined assault by hundreds. It was not opinion. It was mathematics. But Harold Jansen had decided to gamble everything on the belief that mathematics could be beaten by preparation, discipline, and 18 men who simply refused to run. He had no idea that this obsessive, crazy plan was about to cost the German army an entire day and more dead men than their commander could bear to count. The test came at exactly 6:30 in the morning on March 23rd. The Germans opened with a mortar barrage, accurate and heavy, 6 full minutes of steel raining down on the crest to pin the defenders, while the infantry crossed the open slope. The men facing Jansen belonged to the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, the elite motorized infantry of the German army. Fast, aggressive, battle-hardened. Their commander, Captain Ernst Richter, had been fighting since 1939, and he expected the position to fall in 30 minutes. To him, it was simple arithmetic. Then Jansen's men opened fire, and in a matter of seconds, the German captain's confident arithmetic collapsed into chaos and blood. One German soldier, captured later and questioned by Allied intelligence, described the moment with something close to terror. He said it was as if there were 100 of them up there. He could not understand where the fire was coming from. It seemed to pour in from everywhere at once. That was exactly what Jansen had designed. Every attacker who advanced walked into interlocking fire from angles he could not see and could not escape. A German sergeant watching from behind the first wave noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The fire was not just heavy, it was controlled. These Americans, he realized, knew precisely what they were doing. The first assault shattered in 8 minutes. Richter, stunned, reorganized, called for more mortars, and sent his men up again. The second assault failed even faster than the first, and here something began to crack inside the German ranks that had nothing to do with bullets. It was the horror of watching a plan that could not fail anyway. Everything they had been taught, every rule of numbers and force, said this hill should already be theirs. It was not. Richter later admitted that after the second failure, he understood he was not facing an ordinary defense. He did not yet know what he was facing, but he knew it was not normal. So he adjusted his mortar fire, tightened his formations, and ordered a third assault up that murderous slope. The third assault failed too, its dead sliding back down the frozen slope they had climbed with such confidence minutes before. Inside the American perimeter, the situation was turning desperate. Ammunition was running dangerously low. 2 men had already been wounded. 2 fighting positions had been smashed by mortar fire and had to be rebuilt by hand, while bullets cracked overhead. But Harold Jansen never stopped moving along that line. He walked it calmly, deliberately, letting every man see his face, because he understood that in that moment, his own steadiness was worth more than any machine gun. One of his soldiers, a young man from San Antonio named Raymond Torres, remembered it for the rest of his life. Every time Torres felt his nerves start to crack, every time he thought, "This is it, this is the end," he would look up, and there was Jansen walking the line, calm as a man waiting for a bus. And Torres thought to himself, "If the lieutenant is not scared, then maybe I do not have to be scared yet either." That single fragile thought, multiplied silently across 18 frightened men, was the invisible thing holding the entire hill together, and no German mortar in the world could ever touch it. By early afternoon, Captain Richter had received reinforcements, swelling his force to nearly 350 men. He had studied the slope again. He believed he had finally found the gaps in the American line. He formed up his soldiers for a fourth assault, certain that this time the sheer crushing weight of numbers would simply bury the defenders once and for all. One German corporal in that final wave later wrote about the moment in a memoir published years after the war. He had already climbed that hill 3 separate times. His legs were exhausted. His mind was numb. But he went up again because his captain ordered it and because the men beside him were going. Halfway up the slope, he looked to his left and to his right and saw how many of them there were, and he thought, how can 18 men possibly stop us all? And then the fire started again, and he stopped thinking entirely. The fourth assault climbed into the same storm as the first 3, and on that cold Italian hillside, 18 ordinary men, farmers and welders and mechanics, led by a quiet football player from Lubbock, braced themselves to decide the outcome of a battle that every rule of war said they had already lost. By the time the smoke finally cleared, the German army had thrown itself at hill 587 4 separate times and been hurled back 4 separate times, leaving more than 140 men dead and wounded on the slope. 18 Americans had done what an entire battalion could not undo. But their fight was far from over. Their ammunition was almost gone. Their commander was about to make a decision that would ripple far beyond that single ridge into the entire German line. And in a quiet headquarters tent, a German intelligence officer was already preparing to write a report so unsettling that it would change how the German army viewed the American soldier for the rest of the war. But could 18 exhausted men, nearly out of bullets, truly hold against everything the Germans were about to bring next? And what did that one desperate day on Hill 587 secretly cost the enemy across the entire front? In Part 2, we will follow the aftermath. The American Army tried to forget the German confession that still survives in the archives to this day, and the astonishing chain reaction that 18 men set off on a nameless hill in the mountains of Italy. When we left Hill 587, Second Lieutenant Harold Jansen and 18 men from Texas had done the impossible. 4 times a German battalion of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division had climbed that frozen slope. 4 times Jansen's carefully rehearsed web of interlocking fire had broken them and sent them tumbling back down. More than 140 Germans lay dead or wounded on the hillside. And yet, as the last light drained out of the Italian sky on March 23, 1944, the exhausted defenders were about to face a new enemy. An enemy that did not wear a German uniform. An enemy that spoke English. Because just after dark, the field radio crackled to life, and battalion headquarters gave Harold Jansen an order that made no sense. They ordered him to abandon the hill. To pull his men off the crest, they had bled all day to hold and give it back to the Germans for nothing. Jansen stared at the radio in the dark. He had 2 badly wounded men who could barely walk without help. He had less than a quarter of his ammunition left, and now his own command was telling him to throw away everything those 18 men had earned. And this is where the story gets worse. The voice on the other end of the radio belonged to Major Elliot Crane, the battalion operations officer, a career soldier who had spent 20 long years learning to trust the map over the living man in front of him. Crane was not a coward. He was something more dangerous. He was a man who truly believed the regulations were smarter than the people they governed. And by the book, Crane was right. A ridge held by 18 men, low on ammunition, with wounded, and no clear line of resupply, was a liability. The manual called for consolidating the line to more defensible ground. Crane intended to follow the manual. Crane had built his entire career on a simple principle. Hold what you can defend, and never gamble men on ground that cannot be supplied. In peacetime, that principle had earned him promotions. On this night, it was about to cost the whole battalion. What Crane did not understand, sitting in a warm command post 4 miles behind the fighting, was what Hill 587 actually was. He saw a number on a map. Jansen, standing on the crest in the freezing dark, saw the truth. That ridge was the shoulder of the entire sector. It overlooked the only road the Germans could use to swing around and flank the American line. Give up the hill, and within 48 hours, the Germans would pour an entire division through that gap. Hold it, and the German offensive in this sector was strangled before it began. Jansen understood the geometry of the battlefield in a way the map could not show. So he did the one thing a young lieutenant is never supposed to do. He argued. The conversation that followed was later reconstructed from the recollections of the radio operator who sat beside Jansen that night, a 19-year-old private who never forgot a word of it. "You will withdraw to the secondary line by 0400, Crane said. "That is a direct order." "Sir, if we pull off this ridge, we hand the Germans the flank road," Jansen answered. "They'll be behind the whole battalion by morning." "That is not your assessment to make, Lieutenant. With respect, sir, I'm the only officer standing on the ground. You're looking at a map." There was a long silence on the line. Then Crane's voice came back colder than before. "Every hour you sit on that rock, I have men dying in the valley," Crane snapped. "You are not the whole war, Lieutenant." "No, sir," Jansen said quietly. "But this hill might be. You will follow your orders, or I will find an officer who does. Do you understand what I am saying to you?" Jansen understood perfectly. He was being told that if he stayed, he would be relieved of command and court-martialed for disobeying a direct order in the face of the enemy. That charge in wartime could end with a firing squad. 23 years old, exhausted, outnumbered, and now his own army was pointing a gun at his back. A single word of obedience would have saved his career and very possibly his life. The pressure was crushing. German patrols were probing the base of the hill. Elsewhere along the front, the Panzer Grenadiers were pushing forward, and casualty reports were climbing by the hour. Every instinct of self-preservation told Jansen to obey. But he found an unexpected ally in the darkness, and that ally was about to change everything. His name was Captain Roy Hendricks, and he had no business being on that hill at all. Hendricks was an artillery forward observer attached to Jansen's sector to call in fire support, and he had spent the entire day lying in a shell hole near the crest, watching through his binoculars as 18 men did something he had never seen in 3 years of war. Hendricks outranked Jansen. More importantly, Hendricks had a radio net that reached all the way back to the guns and to the regimental commander over Crane's head. Hendricks crawled to Jansen's position in the dark and said something the lieutenant would remember for the rest of his life. "I've watched a lot of positions fold today, son. I have never watched one do what yours did. If you're staying, I'm staying, and I'm bringing every gun I can reach with me." For a long moment, Jansen said nothing. He had spent the whole day expecting to be alone, expecting to be forgotten, and now here was a captain with a radio and a promise. Hendricks believed in the crazy idea because he had watched it work with his own eyes. He understood something Crane never would. Jansen's men were not just holding a hill. They were a machine that turned open ground into a killing zone, and if you fed that machine with artillery, it became something no battalion in the German army could break. Together in the space of 2 hours, the two men built a plan. It was brutally simple. They would hold the hill for one more night. At first light, the Germans would come again, and this time in far greater numbers. Intelligence from prisoners, taken during the day, suggested Captain Richter had been reinforced with a fresh battalion, bringing the total force gathering at the base of the ridge to nearly 500 men. Jansen had 18. But this time, Jansen would not fight alone. Hendricks would register every approach, every draw, every fold in the slope. And when the Germans came, he would drop a wall of steel on top of them while Jansen's rifles did the rest. The conditions were merciless. They had one night to prepare and one chance to get it right. If the dawn assault broke through, there would be no second try. The flank would be open, the battalion would be rolled up from the side, and hundreds of Americans in the valley below would die in their sleep. Hendricks used his own radio authority to quietly override Crane reporting up the chain that the position was being held on the direct initiative of an artillery observer, which technically it was. Then came the hardest part: ammunition. Jansen's men were nearly dry. Under cover of darkness, a handful of volunteers made 3 trips down the reverse slope and back, hauling boxes of rifle rounds and grenades up 800 yards of frozen ground, while German flares burst overhead. By 0500, every fighting position had been topped up. Every field of fire had been re-registered with the guns. Jansen walked the line one last time in the dark, stopping at each hole, saying almost nothing, just letting every man see his face the way he had the day before. 2 of them were barely 18 years old. All of them knew what dawn would bring. And in the gray hour before the sun, the fog rolled in off the mountains and swallowed the slope whole. If they failed now, everything died with them. The assault came at 0620, almost exactly the same hour as the day before, but everything else was different. This time, the fog clung to the slope in thick gray sheets, and out of that fog came not 300 men, but the better part of 500 moving in staggered waves across a broader front than Jansen had ever faced. Watching from a rear observation post brought forward specifically to witness the withdrawal he had ordered, sat Major Elliot Crane. He had arrived to confirm that Jansen had disobeyed him. Instead, he was about to watch the argument settle itself in blood. For the first 90 seconds, it looked like a catastrophe. The fog swallowed the German waves, and Jansen's men could not see them until they were close, far too close. On the American right, a machine gun position opened fire, its tracers stitching red lines through the fog, then abruptly went silent as a German grenade found it. 2 of Jansen's 18 were down. One of them was the gunner who had helped haul ammunition up the slope only hours before. A gap had opened on the flank, and cold morning air poured through it along with the Germans. Through it, a dozen Panzer Grenadiers surged toward the crest, and for one terrible moment, Hill 587 was about to fall. Then Captain Hendricks spoke 3 words into his radio. Fire mission, now! What happened next, the German survivors described for the rest of their lives. The entire face of the slope erupted. Hendricks had pre-registered every yard of that ground during the night, and now 4 batteries of American artillery dropped their shells exactly where he had told them, a rolling curtain of high explosive that walked up the hill and tore the German waves apart from behind. The Panzer Grenadiers who had broken through the flank suddenly found themselves cut off, and Jansen personally led 3 men across the crest to seal the gap with grenades and rifle fire at a range of 10 feet. Torres, the young rifleman from San Antonio, was one of the 3 who went with him. He would later say he did not remember deciding to move. He only remembered Jansen's voice, calm as ever, saying, "With me," and then his own legs carrying him across the crest into the smoke. The fighting on that flank lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, the breach was closed, and the slope below was a churning mass of smoke and fire, and men trying desperately to fall back. For a heartbeat, the whole hill went quiet, and Jansen thought it might be over. It was not. But the Germans did not break. Not yet. Richter, somewhere down in that fog, reorganized and drove them up a second time and a third exactly as he had the day before. And each time the same thing happened. Jansen's rifles found them, funneled them, held them in the open. And Hendricks's guns fell on them like the hand of God. The integrated machine Jansen had built, now married to the artillery Hendricks controlled, was doing something the German army had no answer for. It was not just stopping the assault. It was systematically dismantling the battalion that made it wave by wave in the space of a single morning. Down in the fog, Captain Richter watched his companies dissolve and understood too late that he had walked his men into a trap 18 Americans had spent the night building for them. By 900, it was over. The fog burned off to reveal a hillside carpeted with the German dead. Later, German records placed the losses from that single morning at more than 200 casualties on top of the day before a combined total that had shattered 2 assault battalions and rendered them combat ineffective for weeks. 18 Americans, reinforced only by the voice of one artillery observer, had annihilated a force that outnumbered them nearly 28-1. At the rear observation post, Major Elliot Crane lowered his binoculars. The private who had operated Jansen's radio the night before described the moment Crane's report reached them later that day. The man who had threatened Jansen with court-martial had written only one line about the officer he had tried to relieve. He wrote, "Recommend 2nd Lieutenant Jansen for immediate decoration. His judgment of the ground was correct. My assessment was wrong." For an officer of Crane's generation and pride, those last 4 words were harder to write than any battle order he had ever signed. Skepticism had become shock. Shock had become belief. The book had lost to the man. But surviving the test was one thing. What came next would prove far larger than a single hill. Because holding Hill 587 had done exactly what Jansen swore it would do. The German flanking mission, the whole reason 500 men had died trying to take that ridge, never happened. Richter's shattered battalions could not advance. The mission was handed off to another German unit less prepared and badly positioned, and when they finally moved, they moved late and into the teeth of an American line that was ready for them. Allied intelligence spotted the resulting gap in the German timetable and drove into it. By the most conservative estimate, the stubborn defense of one nameless ridge by 18 men shortened the fight for that entire sector by 10 to 14 days. 10 to 14 days. In the grinding arithmetic of the Italian front, where the Gustav Line had already cost thousands of lives over 4 months, that was not a footnote. That was hundreds of American, British, and French colonial soldiers in that sector who would live to see the summer. Most of them never knowing the name of the lieutenant or the hill that had bought them those days. And now, the American command that had wanted to abandon the hill faced an uncomfortable new problem. Jansen's method worked. It worked so well that it demanded to be understood and copied. But armies are not built to learn quickly, and the old guard resisted. Some senior officers dismissed Hill 587 as a fluke, a lucky stand that could never be repeated. Others insisted that no sane commander would ever bet a sector on 18 men and one forward observer. Jansen, promoted and quietly sent along the line, found himself doing the last thing he expected. He became a teacher, moving from position to position, showing other lieutenants how to walk their ground, assign their fields of fire, and marry their rifles to the guns behind them. It did not always take. Some units listened and lived. Others shrugged, kept doing things the old way, and paid for it. But where Jansen's ideas were adopted, the results spoke a language no skeptic could argue with. The difference was measurable. Before Jansen's methods spread, small isolated positions in that sector fell to determined German assault more often than they held, and a platoon caught alone could expect to be overrun within an hour. After those same kinds of positions began holding for a full day or longer, and some never fell at all. Small American positions that should have crumbled began holding against 3 and 4 times their number. German assault companies that had grown used to overrunning thin defensive lines began coming apart on slopes that suddenly bristled with coordinated fire. On the German side of the front, confusion spread through the ranks. Units that had expected easy ground reported ambushes, walls of artillery, and defenders who simply would not move. German casualty figures in these small actions climbed sharply. In some engagements, the attacking Germans were losing 5 and 6 men for every American they killed, an exchange rate no army on earth could sustain for long. And no one on the German staff could yet explain why. From an idea that a battalion operations officer had tried to bury, and a stand that had nearly ended in a court-martial, Harold Jansen's way of fighting was spreading quietly along the Italian front, one ridge at a time. But the enemy was watching too. And the Germans, unlike the Americans, understood immediately that something dangerous was happening to them. Far behind the lines in a division intelligence office, a meticulous officer named Major Heinrich Schreiber was collecting every after-action report, every prisoner statement, every account of these strange, unbreakable American positions. He was building a file page by page in the patient way of a man who knows he is looking at something important. He was hunting for the pattern behind these unbreakable American hills. And when he found it, he would write a memorandum so sharp and so unsettling that it would climb all the way up the German chain of command and change the way the entire Wehrmacht thought about the American soldier. Schreiber's conclusion would be simple, and it would be terrifying to his superiors. The Americans had found a way to make a handful of ordinary men fight like a fortress, and the German army had been consistently, catastrophically underestimating it. Once Berlin understood that the Germans would stop trying to smash these positions head-on, they would start hunting for a way to break them from the inside. In Part 3, we will follow Schreiber's report as it travels up to the highest levels of the German command, and we will see the Germans begin to design a deliberate, cold-blooded answer to Harold Jansen's 18 men. Because when your enemy finally understands your greatest weapon, he does not run from it. He builds a weapon of his own, and the real war for the soul of the Italian front was only just beginning. Let us remember where we stand. A 23-year-old lieutenant from Lubbock had turned 18 ordinary men into an unbreakable fortress on a nameless hill. He had proven it under fire at Hill 587, married his rifles to Captain Hendrix's artillery, and shattered 2 German battalions in a single morning. Then his way of fighting began to spread along the Italian front, one ridge at a time. And in Part 2, we left a German intelligence officer, Major Heinrich Schreiber, hunched over a growing file, hunting for the pattern behind these strange, unkillable American positions. He found it. And when his report reached the German High Command, it did not cause admiration. It caused alarm. In the first 3 months of 1944, small American units using these tactics had inflicted casualties on German assault forces at a rate the staff called, in one surviving memo, operationally unsustainable. The Germans were losing veterans they could not replace, and now this was no longer an experiment. This was a weapon, and the enemy had finally decided to fight back with everything it had. Schreiber's memorandum climbed the chain of command with unusual speed. It passed from division to corps, from corps toward the staff of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring himself. What made it so unsettling was not emotion. It was arithmetic. Schreiber had counted. Across a dozen small engagements that spring German assault detachments attacking these fortified American positions were suffering losses of 4, 5, sometimes 6 men for every American killed. In one action, a reinforced company of roughly 160 men had been reduced to fewer than 40 combat-effective soldiers in 90 minutes. In another, an assault meant to take a ridge before breakfast was still failing at nightfall, having cost the attackers more than half their strength for a piece of ground the size of a football field. These were not the numbers of a secondary front. These were the numbers of a slaughter. And slaughter spread across a whole front wins wars. Schreiber understood that better than his superiors did. He was not warning them about one hill. He was warning them about a method that if the Americans ever learned to scale, it could bleed the German army in Italy to death one ridge at a time. The German response was fast, cold, and professional. The response of an army that had survived 5 years of war by refusing to lose the same way twice. Kesselring's staff convened what amounted to an emergency tactical review. Their conclusion was blunt. Stop attacking these positions the way we have been attacking them. The old doctrine of overwhelming a thin defense with a determined frontal assault, the doctrine that had worked for the German army since 1939, was suicide against a Janssen-style hill. So they changed. They stopped charging up the slopes in broad daylight. They began probing at night in small infiltration teams, trying to slip between the American fields of fire before the guns could find them. They pulled flamethrowers forward to burn defenders out of their holes. They brought up self-propelled guns to blast the fighting positions apart at close range. The Germans, to their credit, adapted faster than the Americans had any right to expect, and they went hunting for the thing that made the whole system work. Schreiber had identified the weak link with chilling clarity. It was not the rifleman. It was the forward observer. The single man with the radio who called down the artillery. Break that link, Schreiber argued, and the fortress becomes just 18 tired men with rifles again. So the Germans formed specialized assault squads with one priority above all others. Find the observer, kill the radio, blind the guns. The fighting turned uglier almost overnight. German raiders began slipping onto American-held ridges in the dark Knives Out, searching for antennas and map cases. Casualties among artillery observers in that sector climbed sharply through April of 1944. Hendricks himself survived 2 separate attempts to overrun his position, once fighting off German infiltrators with a carbine at point-blank range while still shouting corrections into his radio. Twice they came for him in the dark. Twice he lived. But other observers up and down the line were not so lucky, and each one who died left another handful of riflemen suddenly alone. The War of the Ridgelines had become a private savage duel between 2 ideas. The American idea that a few good men could hold anything, and the German idea that any system, however brilliant, has a throat you can cut. For weeks the outcome hung in the balance, but the Germans were not the only enemy Janssen would have to face. The next threat did not wear field gray. It came from behind his own lines. Because as Janssen's method spread, something began to go wrong. It spread too fast, and it spread badly. Officers who had heard about Hill 587 tried to copy it without understanding it. They memorized the drills. They assigned the fields of fire. But they treated it as a formula, a rigid checklist to be followed instead of what it truly was, and the difference proved catastrophic. In late April, a Green American platoon on a ridge north of the valley did everything by the book Janssen had written. They had the positions. They had the interlocking fire. What they did not have was a reliable artillery link or an officer the men would die for. When the Germans came at night with flamethrowers and infiltration squads hunting for a radio that was already dead, the platoon broke. It broke badly. The men had the drills, but they did not have the thing that made the drills matter. More than 30 American soldiers were killed or captured in under an hour, and the ridge fell. The artillery cut off from its observer never fired a useful round. And when the after-action reports were written, a dangerous whisper began to move through the command. Maybe the method was flawed. Maybe Hill 587 had been luck. Maybe this Lieutenant Janssen was selling a miracle that got ordinary men killed. The blame landed squarely on Jansen. Senior officers who had never wanted to change demanded to know why a junior lieutenant's ideas were being spread across a front without proper doctrine, without testing, without control. One colonel put it cruelly. "A miracle you cannot repeat," he said, "is not a doctrine. It is a lie that gets men killed." There was talk of pulling Jansen off the line entirely, of quietly filing away everything he had learned and pretending Hill 587 had never happened. For the first time since that cold March morning, Harold Jansen doubted himself. He walked the ruined ridge where the platoon had died. He looked at the empty foxholes and the burned equipment and the churned ground where 30 young men had been lost, and he asked himself the question every honest man dreads. Had he built something real? Or had he just gotten lucky and gotten 30 men killed for it? The answer when it came to him was simple and hard. The method was never a formula. It was leadership, integration, and trust, and you could not photocopy those onto a map. You could teach a man where to place his machine gun. You could not teach him in an afternoon to make 18 frightened soldiers believe they would live if they held. That part had to be earned hole by hole, night by night, the way Jansen had earned it. A hill did not hold because of the drills. It held because of the men and the man who led them. That truth would either save his idea or bury it. And then came the order that would put it to the ultimate test. Its name was Operation Diadem. May 11, 1944. The great Allied offensive to break the Gustav Line at last and drive on Rome. 500,000 men. More than 20 divisions across a front stretching from the sea to the mountains. 1,500 guns opening fire in a single thunderclap at 11 o'clock at night. The largest coordinated assault of the entire Italian campaign. And standing in the way of Rome, sat a final German barrier, the Caesar Line anchored on the town of Velletri and the mountains of the Alban Hills. The 36th Infantry Division, Jansen's division, drew the hardest ground. Velletri was a fortress. A frontal assault would cost thousands. But the division's commander, Major General Fred Walker, had found something. A gap. A 3-mile seam between two German corps running up the slopes of Monte Artemisio that the Germans had left thinly held because they believed the terrain was impassable to a large force. Walker's plan was audacious to the point of madness. Push an entire division in silence at night straight up through that gap and onto the mountain behind the German line. It was Hill 587 turned inside out. Instead of a handful of men holding one hill, it was thousands of men moving like a handful of men. Silent. Coordinated. Every unit knowing its exact ground. Everything Jansen had taught scaled up to the size of a division. Silence instead of firepower. Knowledge of the ground instead of weight of numbers. Trust instead of orders shouted into the dark. And Jansen, now trusted despite the whispers, went forward with the lead elements back where he had started, on a slope in the dark, with men who were counting on him. The night of May 30th, 1944. No artillery, no barrage, no warning. The men move. They climb in single file through the dark. Boots wrapped in cloth. No talking. No lights. 2,000 men and more threading a 3-mile gap between sleeping German positions. To the left, a German outpost. To the right, another. In between, a river of Americans flowing uphill in total silence. A dog barks somewhere below. Everyone freezes. Hearts pound. Nobody breathes. A German sentry 30 yards away strikes a match to light a cigarette. The whole column watches the tiny flame. If he turns, if he lifts his head, if he sees the shapes on the slope, the entire division is trapped on open ground with no artillery and no escape. The match goes out. The sentry does not turn. The column moves again. Up, higher. The slope steepens. Men grab roots and rocks and haul themselves toward the crest. Jansen moves near the front, doing exactly what he did at Hill 587, watching the ground, reading the angles, keeping the men calm with nothing but his presence. A man slips. A rock clatters down the slope. Somewhere, a soldier bites down on his own hand to keep from crying out. Time stretches. Minutes feel like hours. and still impossibly, the Germans do not wake. Yard by yard, the mountain gives itself up to men who simply refuse to make a sound. By dawn on May 31st, the impossible has happened. The 36th Division sits on top of Monte Artemisia, behind the German line, on the high ground, looking down on the enemy that thought the mountain could not be climbed. Then the Germans wake up. The reaction is chaos. German officers cannot believe it. There are Americans above them, where no Americans should be, where no army was ever supposed to be. The artillery that Jansen and men like him have made into an art form comes screaming down from the heights onto German positions that suddenly have nowhere to hide. The observers are on the summit now. They can see everything. And they call down fire on everything they see. Shells rain on the roads. German trucks burn. Columns scatter. Ammunition dumps go up in gouts of flame. Men who had slept safely behind the line an hour ago now die under fire from a mountain they were told could not be climbed. It is Hill 587, again multiplied 100-fold, and this time it is the Germans on the wrong end of the guns. The Caesar Line. The last barrier before Rome does not slowly bend. It cracks. It buckles. It comes apart from the inside exactly the way the Germans had once hoped to break Jansen. Faster than they can react. Deeper than they can plug. Wider than they can hold. The whole German defensive scheme in the sector, built over weeks with typical German care, unravels in a single day. A German officer captured that day said it plainly in his debrief. They came over ground we did not guard because we were certain no army could cross it. When we understood they were behind us, the position was already lost. Panzer Grenadier units that had held for months began pulling back in a hurry. Some fought. Many ran. Torres, the rifleman from San Antonio, who had crossed the crest at Hill 587, was on that mountain too. Years later, he described the sunrise on Monte Artemisia in a single sentence. "We looked down on the whole German army," he said, "and for the first time in this war, they were the ones who did not know what was coming." That was the feeling on the summit that morning. The hunters had become the hunted, and everyone on that mountain knew it. The German command in the sector, so meticulous, so professional, had been outthought on its own mountain. German artillery that tried to answer was hunted down from above and silenced. Roads that were supposed to carry reinforcements forward instead carried a broken army backward. Within 72 hours, the road to Rome was open. On June 4, 1944, American troops entered the Eternal City to cheering crowds and church bells. Rome, the first Axis capital to fall, was liberated after nearly 9 months of grinding, bloody stalemate in the mountains. And a piece of that victory, a real and traceable piece, ran straight back to a nameless hill in March, and 18 men who had refused to break on a slope nobody would ever put in a history book. News of the breakthrough raced ahead of the advancing columns, and everything changed. Suddenly, nobody was whispering that Jansen's ideas were a fluke. The method that had held one hill had helped crack a fortress line and open the road to Rome. Across the Italian front, other divisions studied what the 36th had done. The principles spread not as a rumor now, but as accepted practice. Small units learned to hold. Observers learned to move with the infantry. Riflemen learned that 18 men who knew their ground could do the work of 100. What had started as one lieutenant's stubborn refusal to die on a hill had become in the space of 10 weeks part of the way an entire army fought. The numbers told the story. German losses in the Diadem offensive ran into the tens of thousands. Entire divisions were mauled. The German army in Italy, which had held the Allies for 8 brutal months, was thrown into a retreat that would carry it hundreds of miles north. And the exchange rate that Schreiber had warned about, the 4 and 5 German dead for every American, was no longer a curiosity in a memo. It was the shape of the whole campaign. War correspondents seized on the story of Rome. The propaganda value was enormous, though it landed just 2 days before Normandy stole every headline in the world. For the men in the line, the effect was electric. They had spent months being told Italy was the forgotten front, the orphan war. Now, they had taken a capital. Morale surged. On the German side, it collapsed in equal measure. Prisoners spoke of exhaustion, of being outmaneuvered, of an enemy that no longer fought the way the manuals said he should. Faster than expected. Smarter than expected. Deadlier than expected. The three words that would haunt German reports for the rest of the Italian campaign. And the recognition came quietly the way it always did for these men. Harold Janssen was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration the United States Army can give. Captain Hendricks was decorated for the artillery work that had made the fortress ridges possible. Promotions followed. The 36th Infantry Division, the Texas outfit of farmers and welders and mechanics, had earned a reputation that would follow it all the way into southern France and beyond to the end of the war. The men who had been told they were fighting a forgotten campaign had helped take the first enemy capital of the Second World War. From an idea, a battalion operations officer once tried to bury to the fall of Rome. That was the arc. That was the payoff. But here is the strange, quiet truth at the heart of it all. The world remembered Rome. It did not remember the hill. It remembered the parades and the headlines and the photographs of American jeeps rolling past the Colosseum. It forgot the frozen slope in March, where 18 men decided individually not to break. And so this story has one final chapter. Because the war would end, the soldiers would go home. And the men who had understood exactly what happened on those ridges, the Germans who tried to take them and could not, would spend the rest of their lives trying to name the thing they had encountered. What became of Harold Janssen? What became of Torres and Hendricks and the 18? Why did a story this extraordinary vanish so completely from the memory of the nation it belonged to? And what was the word the Germans searched for and never found? In Part 4, the final chapter, we come home, and we discover what these men were truly made of long after the guns went silent. This is where it ends, and where it truly begins. Over the last 3 parts, we have watched a 23-year-old football player from Lubbock, Texas, take an idea the manuals called insane 18 ordinary men and one frozen hillside and turn them into something the German army could not break. We watched that idea survive a court-martial threat, marry itself to artillery at Hill 587, and grow until it helped crack the Caesar Line and open the road to Rome. From a nameless ridge in March to the first Axis capital to fall in June. That was the war. But the question that has been waiting since Part 3 is the quiet one. What happened to the man who did all of this? And the answer, when you finally hear it, contains a final twist that almost no one ever saw coming. Because sometimes the price of doing something extraordinary is that the world simply forgets you ever did it. Harold Janssen survived the war. That fact alone makes him luckier than millions. He came off the line after Rome fought on through southern France and into the bitter cold of the German border campaigns, and when the guns finally went silent in the spring of 1945, he did what nearly every American soldier did. He took off the uniform. He went home. He did not write a book. He did not go on the lecture circuit. He did not trade on what he had done for money or fame or office, though a lesser man easily could have. He returned to Lubbock, to the flat and wind-scoured Texas panhandle where the whole story had begun, and he did the most ordinary thing imaginable. He became a high school history teacher. Think about that for a moment. The man who had held Hill 587 against a German battalion, who had climbed Monte Artemisio in the dark and helped take Rome, spent the next 31 years standing in front of teenagers, teaching them about a war he almost never admitted he had fought in. His former students remember him the same way his soldiers did. Quiet, steady, patient. A man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He taught the Second World War the way he taught everything else from the textbook, at a careful distance, and when the lessons touched the Italian campaign, he did not tell them he had been there. He would point to the map, to the Gustav Line, to Monte Cassino, to the long, bloody road to Rome, and then he would simply move on to the next chapter. The students who filed through his classroom for 3 decades had no idea that the mild-mannered man at the chalkboard had once been the reason hundreds of families might not have had fathers and grandfathers at all. There is a story passed down among a few of his old students that once, near the end of a lesson on Italy, A boy in the back row asked him if he had ever been in a real battle. Jansen looked at the map for a long moment. Then he said quietly that he had known some good men over there, and that a lot of them did not come home, and that they deserved to be remembered better than they were. And then the bell rang, and he never said another word about it. Those students would only learn the truth decades later. Some of them at his funeral, when a folded flag and a citation revealed the man they thought they had known. The others scattered the way that generation scattered. Raymond Torres, the rifleman from San Antonio, who had crossed the crest under fire, went back to Texas and worked for the city water department for 27 years, fixing pipes and reading meters, telling almost no one what he had seen on those hills. Thomas Kowalski returned to Pittsburgh and went into the steel business, following his father into the mills. Captain Roy Hendricks, the artillery observer, who had refused to leave that ridge, went home to a quiet life. Few of his neighbors would ever fully understand a man who had once held a mountain with a radio, and now spent his evenings on a porch, saying little. Of the 18 who stood on Hill 587, some did not live to grow old at all, falling in France or Germany in the long months of fighting that came after Italy. The ones who survived carried it silently the way that entire generation carried everything, folding the worst and the best days of their lives into a silence that their children would spend the rest of their own lives trying to understand. And Major Elliott Crane, the officer who had once threatened to have Jansen shot for disobedience, carried to the end of his days the memory of the one line he had been forced to write. My assessment was wrong. Some men are defined for all time by their victories. Major Elliott Crane was quietly permanently reshaped by a single admission. There were no parades for Hill 587, no films, no best-selling books, no newsreels, no reunions splashed across the papers, no reporters knocking on doors in Lubbock or San Antonio or Pittsburgh. The men grew old and grew quiet, and one by one they slipped out of the world. Harold Jansen died in 1989. His Distinguished Service Cross sits today in a display case in a regimental museum beside a faded photograph of a young man in olive drab who looks nothing like the legend the reports would make you imagine. Just a boy from Lubbock squinting into the sun who had no idea what he would soon be asked to do or what he would prove could be done. But his real legacy was never in the metal in that glass case. It was in something much larger and much harder to see. Because the way Harold Jansen fought did not die with his generation. It became part of the American way of war. Strip Hill 587 down to its essence, and you find a handful of principles that would echo for the rest of the century. A small unit that knows its ground intimately can defeat a much larger one. Leadership at the lowest level, the sergeant and the lieutenant on the spot, matters more than orders shouted from miles behind. And infantry, married to responsive, accurate firepower, becomes something far greater than the sum of its parts. Those were the lessons of the Italian ridges. The United States Army spent the next 80 years building on them. In Korea, only 5 years after the war, American soldiers found themselves again holding brutal exposed hilltops against enemies who attacked in overwhelming numbers. Places like Porkchop Hill and Old Baldy became legends for exactly the reason Hill 587 should have and never did. Small groups of men dug in on high ground, calling down artillery through forward observers, holding against odds that the mathematics said were hopeless. The names were different. The principle was identical. And the cost of forgetting it was measured in blood, because wherever American units were dug in with good leaders and responsive guns, they held. And wherever they were not, they did not. In Vietnam, the idea evolved again. The fire support base, a small perimeter of infantry built entirely around the guns at its center, was Hill 587, turned into standard doctrine. A few companies of men could dominate miles of jungle, not because there were many of them, but because any enemy who massed to attack them would vanish under a storm of coordinated fire. The forward observer, the single most important man in Jansen's system, had become the beating heart of how America fought, and that man never went away. He simply grew more powerful. Today, the descendant of Roy Hendricks lying in his shell hole with a radio is called a Joint Terminal Attack Controller, a JTAC. And he can call down not just 4 batteries of artillery, but precision-guided bombs attack helicopters and aircraft from 100 miles away, all onto a target the size of a car. A tiny team of soldiers with one of these men attached can now hold ground, or take it that once would have required an entire battalion of infantry to contest. The technology is unrecognizable. The principle that firepower directed by the man who can actually see the enemy is the great multiplier of small units is exactly what a forward observer proved on a slope in Italy in 1944. There is more. The other half of what Schreiber, the German intelligence officer, identified has become its own field of study. He wrote that American resilience came not from ideology, but from the immediate social bonds of the small unit intensified by shared extremity. After the war, military researchers studied that idea relentlessly, filling entire libraries with analysis of why some units break under pressure and others do not, and they confirmed again and again what the Germans had learned the hard way on those Italian ridges. Men do not fight and die for flags or speeches. They fight for the handful of comrades beside them and for the leader they trust. That understanding, born on battlefields like Hill 587, now shapes how every modern professional army trains, organizes, and holds its units together. Armies across dozens of nations from NATO to the far side of the world build their small unit doctrine on the same truth those 18 Texans proved with their lives. It is impossible to count exactly how many lives that single insight has saved over 80 years of war and near war. But the honest answer runs well into the hundreds of thousands soldiers who came home because a small unit could hold, because a leader on the ground was trusted to decide, and because firepower could be summoned by the man who could actually see the enemy. One frozen hill in 1944 rippled outward into every conflict that followed. But the biggest lesson of Hill 587 was never really about tactics or technology at all. It was about where good ideas come from and about how badly the systems we build resist them. Harold Janssen was nobody. He was not a general, not a staff officer, not a graduate of a war college. He was a football player from a small town who happened to understand something about men and ground that the manuals had missed. His idea did not come down from the top. It came up from the bottom, from a lieutenant standing in the dirt with cold hands and 18 frightened men, and the institution above him nearly crushed it before it could draw a single breath. Remember Major Crane and the withdrawal order and the threat of a firing squad. The system did not welcome the innovation that would save it. The system tried to bury it. This is not a story unique to one hill. It is one of the oldest patterns in human history. The people closest to a problem often see the solution first, and the institutions above them, invested in the old way, resist. The Second World War was full of exactly these stories. The Higgins boat, the landing craft that carried men onto the beaches of Normandy, and a dozen other invasions, was designed not by the Navy, but by a stubborn Louisiana boat builder the Navy brass initially dismissed. The specialized armored vehicles that cleared the way on D-Day, mocked at first as one eccentric general's toys, saved thousands of lives. Radar code-breaking night infiltration. So much of what won the Second World War began as an idea that someone in authority first called impossible, impractical, or insane. The pattern is almost a law of history. The breakthrough arrives from the margins. From the tinkerer, the outsider, the junior officer nobody was listening to, and the established powers greet it first with mockery and only later reluctantly with medals. Harold Janssen belongs on that list, and the pattern he embodies did not end in 1945. Look at any organization today, any army, any company, any institution, and you will find the same struggle playing out. The best insight often comes from the person on the ground, the one actually doing the work, and the great question is always whether the people above them are wise enough to listen. Most of the time, they are not. Every so often, though, someone like Captain Hendricks appears, a person with a little authority and a lot of clarity, who sees what is in front of him, ignores what the rulebook tells him to think, and decides to back the impossible idea over the safe one. When that happens, Mountains move sometimes literally. When it does not, we never hear the story at all, because it dies quietly unrecorded the way most good ideas die. How many Harold Jansons has history simply lost men and women with an insight that could have changed everything, silenced by a superior who preferred the safety of the manual? We will never know. That is precisely the point. The ones we remember are the lucky few whose ideas survived long enough to be proven right in blood and steel. And there is one final detail about Hill 587 that almost no one knows. It is the strangest part of the whole story. We know what happened on that ridge. We know the 4 assaults, the 500-man attack, the artillery, the numbers, the names. But here is the twist. We know almost none of it from American sources. The United States Army reduced the entire episode to a footnote and moved on. It was the Germans, the men who lost, who could not stop talking about it. The after-action reports that survived the prisoner of war debriefs, the intercepted letters home, the memoirs published in Frankfurt and Munich in the 1950s and 1960s, the meticulous intelligence memorandum written by a major named Schreiber, these are the documents that preserve the truth. The only reason this story can be told at all is that the enemy was more haunted by those 18 Americans than America ever was. Captain Ernst Richter, the German officer who threw his battalion against that hill and failed, returned to it again and again in his memoirs, the way a man returns to an equation he cannot solve. Near the end of the relevant chapter, he wrote something that comes as close to the heart of this story as anyone ever has. He said he did not know what made those men hold. It was not simply training or equipment or orders. There was something else, and he searched every report he ever read for a better name for it and never found one. In the end, he wrote only this: they decided to hold. Each of them individually decided. And that decision, made independently by 18 separate men on a cold hillside in March of 1944, produced a collective result that defied every rational expectation and cost him a day and more men than he cared to count for the rest of his life. That is the twist at the very end of this story. The most eloquent tribute those 18 Americans ever received was not a medal from their own country, not a monument, not a film, not a single line in a popular history book. It was the confession of the enemy who tried to destroy them and never understood how he had failed. The losers wrote the record. The winners let it disappear. And so the only reason you know this story tonight is that a handful of German officers decades ago could not shake the memory of 18 men on a hill and wrote it all down so that someone someday might finally understand what they had seen. So let us close where the whole thing started on that cold gray morning in March. From a quiet football player from Lubbock, with an idea the manuals called suicidal to the fall of Rome, and 80 years of doctrine that would follow, Harold Janson proved something the powerful are always slow to learn. That courage and clarity can come from the most ordinary man alive, and that the systems built to reject him are almost always wrong to do so. 18 men held a hill that mathematics said could not be held. In doing so, they bought their comrades 10 to 14 days on that sector alone, helped shorten a brutal campaign, saved uncounted lives across an entire front, and quietly reshaped how their nation, and eventually much of the world, would fight for the next 80 years. And they did it not because of who they were, but because of what they each individually chose to do. Richter spent the rest of his life searching for the word to describe what he met on that slope. He never found it. But perhaps the word was never a nationality and never a slogan. Perhaps the word was simpler and harder than that. Perhaps the word was only this: they decided. 18 ordinary men on a forgotten hill in a forgotten war each decided not to break. And because they did, the rest of us get to remember them at all. That is the whole story. That is why it deserved to be told. That is why 80 years later it still matters. Because ordinary people in impossible moments still decide. And that is what those 18 men were made of, long after the guns went silent, long after the medals were locked in their glass cases, and long after the world forgot to say their names.